We said that this preoccupation with afterlife, or the extension of life after death, is also affected by natural conditions. The strict importance of the Nile River running from north to south, where life could exist and perpetuate itself along a very narrow strip, and the rising and setting of the sun from east to west, creating an east to west and north to south coordinates along which we seem to have a strict geometry of orientation as well as a geometrical outlook. And this added to with the durability and strength of materials, the use of stone accentuates this inflexible nature, this very strict design that we see in the Egyptians. So we also talked about Monumental Ization as part of the quest for eternity, turning customary plant forms like papyrus, like lotus, into monumental architectural capitals, as you see in this example. We also have the extensive use of obelisks, which denote the events that the pharaohs wished to be remembered in the future. So they're also designing history for eternity by inscribing events connected with the deeds and lives of the pharaohs and the kingdom of the Egyptians. Here are examples of the petrified plant forms turned into capitals at the end of columns. You see a variety of these columns. To refresh your memory, on the screen you see the Nile River here, and we said that the life of the ancient Egyptians is very easy to see in terms of location. You don't have cities along the edge of the Sahara desert. You don't have cities upon the mountains. You don't have cities along the mountains of the Red Sea, but all the cities are lined up almost in linear fashion along the narrow banks of the Nile River. We said that the river Nile is the life giver, not only because it presents a continuous flow of water, but also because it floods annually, every year, with waters coming from the mountains. It flows from Upper Egypt to Lower Egypt, from the south to the north to the Nile Delta. And in doing so, it becomes loaded with alluvial soil. And the fields along the banks of the Nile become flooded. And once the waters recede and get back into the normal banks of the river, then what is left behind is a natural fertilizer, a rich alluvial deposit. So this made possible the cultivation of fields, and through the harvest of these cultivated fields, through this natural phenomenon which occurred annually, life could go on. So life was strictly keyed to this natural event. It was a very strict rule of nature. It was a regulation of a natural order that made life possible. So this is another aspect which created this notion of rules and canons in the Egyptian attitude to life, which is also reflected in their art, as we saw last time. The beginning of history for the Egyptians, we said, is through this stele, this stone slab, which shows the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. And once Upper and Lower Egypt were united, then we have the beginning of an absolutist order where the Pharaoh was at the very top of the ruling hierarchy. And the Pharaohs were known from the first dynasty onward to several dynasties, which regulated the different phases that we used for datings. The earliest examples of the monumental tombs done for the Ka were in the form of the Mastabas, rectilinear prismatic edifices that you see with a slanted perpendicularity that you see here. These are not strict 90-degree angles stemming from the ground, but they are slightly slanted. And then underneath each mastaba, as you see in this reconstruction drawing, you had a vertical shaft which led to the burial chamber. And the concern with preserving the life of the Ka, preparing for the maintenance of the life of the Ka after death, was not limited to this stone construction, which was very durable, but it was also reflected in the treatment of the walls, which were richly painted with scenes from the life of the deceased. Scenes which show different aspects of the life, which presumably, in a metaphorical sense, would perpetuate themselves after death. So there were scenes showing the plowing of the fields, happy slaves, harvesting the plants of various kinds, the tilling of the soil with bulls. You see the tilling of the soil here, and again you see the work of the slaves in the cultivation of the land. So everything that was necessary for the well-being of this local elite or the local rulers while they were alive are also taken care of for the Ka. Every possible aspect of life is depicted on the walls of the mastaba. And when we look at these very lively and graphic, detailed depictions, we can get a fairly good sense of what was important in the daily life of these ancient Egyptians. In addition to scenes in the field, we also have funerary scenes, as you see here. Here's a boat on the Nile with mourning ladies tousling their hair. Here's a ritual ceremony showing an animal being tied up and chopped up as an offering, kurban, for religious purposes. And the priests or the officials associated with this event are shown in full reality. There is no stylization here, but the encyclopedic correctness to show as many scenes as possible. We also have a very graphic and detailed depiction of the fishes and the animals, birds, not only human figures. And you can see a crocodile here with the scaly tail and the scaly torso, the fins and the tails of the fishes, the scales. And even though the scales may be slightly distorted, it is possible to identify the outstanding characteristics of the type of bird or the type of marine creature that is being depicted here. In addition to the paintings on the walls, there are also small figurines of slave, like this woman here, a slave, a woman kneading bread. She is preparing something with a dough that she is opening up with a rolling pin. In a similar manner, another slave here is also kneading some kind of a dough here, and there are scenes of trampling grapes for making wine or vinegar. Anything that you can imagine which had to do with what went on during the normal life of the deceased. But when it comes to the depictions created for the ka of the pharaohs or people of a higher ranking order, then the depictions follow a more official attitude. In these depictions, in contrast to the depiction of slaves that didn't count in the official arena, we have the employment of strict geometric rules and regulations. That is why this is often known as a very canonical art. A canon is a rule, a set of regulations. So when you look at the canonic art of the Egyptians, you can see it in drawings, you can see it in low reliefs, you can see it in freestanding sculptures. So if you look at the examination of this particular scribe, a scribe is the official note taker. He writes, and that is his duty. And you can tell he is a scribe from the utensils that he is holding in both hands. But the stance is very canonical. It is a rigid profile view. The face is in profile, and the lower torso and the legs, with one leg slightly forward, is in a profile. But surprisingly, the upper torso, the part between the neck and the the belly here, is done in frontal view. An impossible pose. You can't stand like that. It's not possible to do so unless you distort your body in a rather strange manner. But this was a convention. It was the accepted convention to represent the figure in this accepted official manner. And any change and any deviation from this norm had to do with the dimensions, the number of squares for the leg, the number of squares for the width of the waist or the chest, or the length of the arms or the limbs or whatever. They were not interested in creating something different for the sake of artistic creation that we applaud so highly today. But if they changed anything, the change was done in order to perfect dimensions that were already in hand. So they tried to refine the canon. So the outcome was still rather strict, rather geometric. It didn't show a great deal of variation from what was already at hand, but a better proportioned pose, as you see here. These variations perhaps could be a little bit, varied when you had narrative scenes like this one. Here is the statue of a pharaoh being carried with an army of slaves. The slaves again are in that canonical pose, but there are maybe some slight variations. But the overall canonical rule here has not changed for the canonical art. In many freestanding statues that we see in museums in Cairo, in the British Museum, or the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, or several well-known European museums, we see representations of this Egyptian canonical art. Again, one leg slightly forward, the ever unchanging pose, the arms dangling to the sides, the face gazing, ahead. At no particular point, the gaze is upward. The eyes don't look at anything in particular, but it is a neutralized, representative, accepted pose. And you don't show young people, old people. You don't show crooked noses or chubby cheeks. You show an accepted, official, highly regulated representation. This applied to the tripartite figures. If the gods or the pharaohs were depicted in more than one, with males and females, again, you had the feet with one leg slightly forward, the arms, shown on both sides, and they are posing for eternity in these accepted official poses. Just like the obelisks design history for eternity, these poses are also designed to last forever and ever. Another example here, maybe a slight change in the embrace, but again, the canonical pose, the proportions for the length of the legs, the height of the torso, the dimensions of the face remain unchanging. Same thing for the seated figures. As you see here, another female figure, Lady Senuvi, in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So she is seated on a throne, again with a standard pose. The face has something like a frozen smile. She is not showing any kind of emotion. Emotions are very difficult to come by, almost non-existent. So you see a perfectly proportioned face with the eyes, the frozen lips, the straight hair. So there is an air, an atmosphere of tranquility here. There's no emotion showing her beauty or her feelings of any kind, but she is shown in this accepted official pose with the dimensions, with the proportions, worked to a higher aesthetic than the earlier figures. This attitude of gradual perfection, working with trial and error to make even more perfect and workable a canon at hand, was also applicable in the creation of the tombs of the pharaohs, which we know as the pyramids. And a pyramid is a more monumental version of the mastabas, the tombs of the noblemen. And as you see in this diagram showing a selection of sections of different pyramids, you see experimentation with angles. Sometimes you begin with a wider angle. The angle becomes narrower after construction has begun for various reasons. Maybe it was necessary to finish the pyramid earlier. Maybe they ran out of material. Maybe they felt that the dimensions would not, work the way they would have desired. And with these sequential experimentations, gradually we received this pyramidal shape, masses of stone piled up in the form of a perfect pyramid with the accepted angles, these shining edifices that advertised the presence of the memory of the deceased forever and ever, for eternity. These were not to be entered once the pharaoh was buried with the tomb gifts and with other paraphernalia. The entrances to the chambers, the corridors, were sealed so that they would not be disturbed in their afterlives. The earliest pyramid that we know is at Saqqara, the stepped pyramid of Zoser, Z-O-S-E-R. And if you look at the reconstruction of Zoser's stepped pyramid here, you see that it is very much reminiscent of mastabas piled one on top of each other, mastabas with a greater area at the bottom, and then smaller mastabas at the top, creating a stepped effect for the pyramid. But that was not all. I mean, that's the monumental burial chamber for the preservation of the body of the pharaoh of Zoser. That's not all. But what we have is for the service of the ka, for the ritualistic funerary purposes, the recreation of a mock city, a false city. So in the mastabas, you had the painted scenes, but a pharaoh's tomb, a pharaoh's ka, obviously had to be served better than the kas for the lower noblemen. So in this case, we have the recreation of a mock city, complete with the city walls, complete with false chambers for each one of the provinces that were under the rule of Zoser. And then there are summer and winter palaces, and then there is a courtyard which would annually reenact, relive, recreate the coronation ceremony of the pharaoh. So his memory would be perpetuated not only with the presence of this monumental stone complex, this monumental edifice, but also with the enactment of ceremonies year after year. So the memory would continue to live on. Here's a better view showing the false chapels. You have a better view of the stepped pyramid. And here are the crenellations and the stone wall around the city, creating the three-dimensional city for the ka of Zoser. The model shows you a close-up view here. Here are the dummy chapels. These are not chapels which had an interior space in which the priests could perform ceremonies. They were stone edifices, stone chapels, and each one stood for the chapel of one particular nome, N-O-M-E. And Nome was one of the provinces ruled by the pharaoh Zoser. Even today, the stepped pyramid continues to impress with the remains of the monumental piling of stones. I mean, this is an architecture of strength and durability. And even in its ruined state, that raw strength piled up by slaves, hundreds of slaves over a long period of time, continues to move us as to the impact of this tremendous amount of labor. Here's a close-up view of the false Mocha chapels, and each one of the chapels is adorned with a pilaster of a lotus capital, which I mentioned at the outset. The plants which were typical to the Egyptians were monumentalized and made symbols representing eternity in architecture. So everything is done to last for a long time, to continue the memory for a long time, and for this a great amount of effort was spent. But the greatest effort of all, as you probably all know from TVs and from your general knowledge, is the complexes that we see in the Giza Valley. And in the Giza, we still have as a prime touristic spot the presence of three pyramids. The pyramids of Cheops, Khephren, and Mykerinos. They are of different sizes, but they again show us a transition at the point of the change of the desert, a transition between, earth and sky, these bold edifices in very unnatural forms. I mean, you don't have such, the crisp, pyramids in nature, and these man-made edifices perpetuate the memory of the pharaohs. But here too, the Nile River is still important, because each one of these pyramids was not standing alone. Each one of them had what we call a funerary temple or a mortuary temple, which created a complex with the pyramid and its temple, and the temple and the pyramid were connected with a corridor. The archaeological evidence for all of this does not survive. So you had the pyramids, and then connecting the pyramids to the shore of the Nile River were mortuary complexes. So just like there were enactments for the coronation of Zoser that we saw in Saqqara, these pharaohs also had annual ceremonies long after their death, which showed the passage of the soul in a representative metaphorical boat along the Nile River. So just like the Nile was the life giver, it was also where the boat, the metaphorical boat, went through the path of transition from life to death. And this was reenacted in the form of a ceremony. And for that reason, the proximity of the river, Nile, the presence of the mortuary temples, connecting them to the pyramids, was highly ritualistic. It wasn't simply a visual monument, but the visuality of the monument was made a part of the lives of the Egyptians by annual ceremonies, which perpetuated the memory. In plan, you probably see this far better. You see the differences in the sizes of the pyramids. The largest one was that of Cheops. And besides the pyramids themselves, you see a number of tombs, quite a number of them, as a matter of fact. These are the Mastabas of the elite, who were sufficiently high in the hierarchy to be buried in the environs of the pyramids of the pharaohs, but they were not pyramids. These were mastabas. So this is the valley of the tombs where the dead are commemorated. And then each one of these pyramids had a narrow corridor which linked the pyramid to a mortuary temple. And the mortuary temples were the places where the ritualistic religious ceremonies took place by the appointed priests. Similar to the pyramids, the mortuary temples were also built of huge monumental blocks of stone, employing granite as well. So they were very difficult to dislodge. They were very difficult to weather by mechanical forces of weathering. So they also lasted forever. This preoccupation for strength, the preoccupation with wanting the man-made not to perish, to challenge the heavenly realm was at the most upright intentions. Looking at the cross-section of the Cheops pyramid, you see that it was not simply a stone mountain. While the tons and tons of stones required an ingenuity of structural solution in order not to endanger what was inside, you had a complex array of corridors and false chambers in order to dissuade tomb robbers. Because once the body was embalmed and buried inside the huge stone mountain, it was not supposed to be disturbed again. And around the embalmed bodies were all kinds of inscribed curses. Tutankhamun's the tomb was opened, as you know, and the British archaeologists who discovered the tomb and who exposed it all died with some mysterious unnatural causes. So maybe the curse of Tutankhamun materialized, we don't know. But these stone mountains were built also to protect the pharaohs' bodies. And this is a strange irony, because on the one hand, there is nothing more visible than a huge, monumental prismatic, mountain standing in the middle of a flat, land. But on the other hand, this visibility is counteracted by shutting off the access to what it is supposed to protect inside. And so you have these arrays of the complex corridors and passages that try to do that. The mortuary temples, as I mentioned a moment ago, are built of monumental stone slabs, usually monolithic in one piece. Here you have these gigantic slabs utilizing a post and a lintel system, that is the loads being carried by the supports, creating a column architrave combination that we see in later Greek and Roman architecture. And this human figure here gives you a fairly good idea about what kind of scale is involved. You have to quarry these enormous blocks of stone. You have to carry them from the quarry, and then you have to hoist them. So even though we know more about the pyramids in the popular press, in the popular literature, the effort and the labor that was expended in the erection of mortuary complexes was no less. I mean, imagine the amount of labor, the manpower that would have been necessary to erect these huge edifices with the monumental blocks of stone. And I can't pass without showing you a slide of the Sphinx. The Sphinx is again in the Giza Valley. It is a monumental statue, challenging the height of the pyramids almost. But even though it's perhaps one of the best known monuments in the world, we don't exactly know what it was intended for. There are various reasons, but I show it to you to show the monumentality that was attained in sculptural form as well, in addition to the mortuary complexes, in addition to the pyramids themselves. Now, when we don't have great chronicles, the testimony of the ancients themselves in extensive writings, as we have in the later centuries, a great deal of burden falls upon interpreting the changes in the monuments that have been built and in the changes of typologies that are utilized. And as the dynasties go forward in the ancient Egyptian culture, we find that after the Giza complexes, the complexes of Cheops, Khephren, and Mycerinus, we find that the preoccupation with creating huge stone pyramids is lessened. So this points to some kind of difference that occurred in religious beliefs. We may not be able to pinpoint exactly what or how those changes took place, but it doesn't take a great deal of intelligence to say that in the earlier years the pyramid was more impressive, more visual, and the more dominant part of the mortuary complex. And then in the later dynasties, we find that the pyramid becomes less important and the mortuary complex becomes more monumental and the center of architectural design. So when we go to Deir el-Bahri, which is further south than Giza along the Nile Valley, we see the mortuary complex of Queen Hatshepsut. And needless to say, the ladies in this class will be happy to know that she was quite a powerful female Egyptian ruler, challenging the male dominance in a very, very early age. So the mortuary complex of Queen Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri is beside the mortuary complex of Pharaoh Amenhotep, which is here. You don't need to remember that name. So you have the mortuary complex of Amenhotep here and the mortuary complex of Queen Hatshepsut here. The first question that you probably would like to ask is, where is the pyramid? Well, there's none to be seen because in Deir el-Bahri, there is no pyramid. You have just the mortuary complex, and in the mortuary complex of Amenhotep, there's a very small pyramid that was on just one of the terraces. So we find that the ceremonial part of the mortuary complex is now far, far more important than building monumental stone edifices, which were the tombs, like the pyramids. Looking at the mortuary complex of Queen Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri in a closer manner through this isometric view, you see the significance of progression, gradual progression, a progression starting from the outside and regulated through a series of courtyards that are linked to each other with a series of ramps that create a processional access. So the movement within this the complex, like the canonical art of the scribes and the standing Egyptians that we saw earlier, is highly regulated. There's no organic free flow of architectural design here. And the tomb of Queen Hatshepsut was hidden in the bowels of the mountain. It's buried within the rock of the limestone hills. So there is no pyramid at all, but the whole attention of the architectural design is concentrated upon creating this mortuary complex. And this is not a palace of the kings. It is associated with death again. So death is still quite important. The significance of the afterlife is still adhered to, but it is done with a different architectural choice at the expense of the pyramid. The pyramid has now been done away with, and we have this highly regimented architecture in the form of a mortuary complex. Even in its ruined state today, the complex, the mortuary complex, is quite extensive. You see the complex of Amenhotep. The pyramid was at the top, a small, pyramid, which became subservient to the mortuary complex itself. And in the mortuary complex of Queen Hatshepsut, the terraces have no pyramid at all. Instead, you have the regulated, processional, movement leading toward the center. So it is highly ceremonial. It's a very rigid architecture, very inflexible, just like the earlier precepts of art that we saw. So this idea of the mortuary complex continues. And we shall look at two mortuary complexes. One is the temple of Ammon, or Ammon-Ra, that was the sun god, at Karnak here. And you see again a very formalized architecture that has monumentalized the typology that we saw in its primitive form at Giza, in the valley of tombs where Khephren, Mykerinos, and Cheops had their pyramids, all the way to the temple of Ammon. So here, the mortuary complex is still sequential, like the earlier examples, but that sequential architecture has become more sophisticated. So the basic idea of progression, stage by stage, from the outside into the inside, having the strict processional access, is still there, but it is highly regulated. It is regulated through pylons, P-Y-L-O-N. And the pylon is a word that you should know. Every person in this class should be familiar with this term. So you had a series of spaces, and each space was approached and entered and exited through these pylons. The first pylon, the second, third, fourth, and fifth. So you went, you had an avenue lined with sphinxes here, with animal creatures, a very impressive avenue, which led you to the first pylon, the monumental gate, which brought you to a courtyard together with the sacred, lake. And then you came to this very idiosyncratic feature, which is a hall, the monumental hall, full of columns, which we call a hypostyle hall. And the hypostyle hall I will show you in greater detail a moment ago. And after this forest of columns, this hall, again through the well-defined corridor in the center, you go to the third pylon, then to the fourth, the fifth, until you get to the tomb, chamber at the very, end. So this idea of having a mortuary complex composed of known spaces, and again here you are not creating an architecture which is trying to be different than what existed before, but you are perfecting it, just like the statue of the scribes that we saw, by making it more perfect, making it more functionally utilizable, by altering the design only as far as it was needed. You're not creating anything very different. You are using the age-old regulations, the age-old design, and you are experimenting with the dimensions, you are perfecting them, and you are not adding anything significantly new here. And here's the sacred, pool, and even in its remains today, the pile of stones in the mortuary complex shows you that it was quite a monumental edifice. A pylon here in its reconstruction shows you the banners and the celebration of the authority of the pharaohs. So they also had a political sort of image, and anyone approaching the mortuary complex adorned with the reliefs on the pylon would make a certain statement, so they were visually quite impressive in that manner. Now, looking at the hypostyle hall of the Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak, the first thing that will probably catch your attention, which has already caught your attention, I'm sure, is the monumentalized columns which have plant forms. The lotus capitals in the central columns and the bundles of papyrus on the flanks. And what we have here is a huge hall full of columns. So you have to imagine this forest of stone, each one of the columns with hieroglyphics on them, inscribing a certain memory to, eternity, and then receiving dim light. The light comes in through this heightened central part, and it is called Clerestory Lighting. I will write it on the board. So it is C-L-E-R-E-S-T-O-R-Y, Clerestory Lighting. And this is a term that you should know. So you have the oblique lighting resulting from the heightened central corridor, which lights the interior through the flanks. So you have a graduated light which is both obstructed and defined further by the presence of these hieroglyphics. So this space, which is dimly lit in a way, is quite in keeping with the mysterious, dark interior that is associated with the mortuary complex. But suffice it to say, even the building process of the mortuary hall itself would have required a tremendous amount of labor and stone to put up each one of these columns, to hoist them, and then to carve them with the hieroglyphics. So here you have the view of the Hypostyle Hall again to remember. You would enter through the pylons into a hall, through the second pylon into the Hypostyle Hall, and gradually, inside. And the heightened columns in the center of the Hypostyle Hall create the passage. You know that you are supposed to continue your direction into the complex through the center. And then the flanks are defined with columns of smaller diameter and, as can be expected, with lesser height. The idea of the mortuary complex did not, change. So when you look at the different, mortuary complexes which ensued, after the one in Karnak or even in parallel to it, you notice that while they are not exactly identical, just like the Hittite temples, which had specific characteristics, but none of which were identical, you have the sequence of passages, you have the sequence of courtyards, and then you may or may not have a hypostyle hall. So here you see a smaller hall here, but that idea of sequence through the different pylons is very much the similar. So a typology of mortuary complexes has been created. And in every aspect, from the approach to the complexes from the outside, and here is an avenue of the sphinxes showing these petrified creatures greeting you on both sides as you come to the first pylon, and then as you actually go inside, encountering the hieroglyphics on the columns themselves, you encounter frozen time, a time that will continue forever, carrying the deeds of the pharaohs. And it may not even be so important that you read these. If you're standing here, obviously you may not be able to read what is on the very top. But the idea that it is recorded, the idea that it is inscribed for the future is a device for the perpetuation of the memory. And the archaeologists have spent a great deal of time trying to record what kinds of hieroglyphics are recorded on stone. And these record victories sometimes. And it is interesting to see that only the victories are included here. And there are instances where we know from other records that the pharaoh had lost the war, but on the hieroglyphics in the temple, he is shown as if he actually won the war. That's the way you design the memory, a very political kind of device. And I leave you with this last slide, which perpetuate the memories of the Egyptians. So from this point on, we shall now move further to the east to deal with Mesopotamia, which is also a culture or a home to a series of cultures that were affected by rivers. We said that the Egyptian culture was regulated by the presence and amenities of the Nile River. And similarly, in the Bronze Age again, further east, where we have Syria today, where we have Iraq today, talking about the normal borders, and part of southeast Turkey, we have the two rivers, two very important rivers, the rivers Euphrates and the river Tigris. And the land between those two rivers is called Mesopotamia. Potamos means river in ancient Greek, and Meso means middle. So Mesopotamos means the land between two rivers. So just like ancient Egypt, where you had a linear arrangement of cities, not out in the desert or on the mountains, but strictly along the banks of the river. When we look at the Bronze Age Mesopotamia, the earlier and later Bronze Age, all the way from 3000 to 2000 and even to the Iron Age to 700 BC, we see that the ancient cities are not away from water, but they are all within the what we call fertile crescent. So we shall be looking at the city of Ur here, U-R. We shall be looking at Mari, a plan of the palace in Mari, which is today in Syria. The rest are in Iraq. And we shall be looking very briefly at Babylon here as well. So Ur, Babylon, Mari, and Khorsabad, the cities, but you don't need to know exactly where they are, except to remember that they are all part of what we call the Fertile Crescent. I mean, this area is a bit like a crescent, the shape of a crescent, the half moon, the bent moon, and it's made possible with the waters of the Euphrates and the Tigris. So within this area, there were many cultures. I mean, we have the Sumerians, we have the Assyrians later on, but I shall not go at all into that, except to show you the transformation of building types, especially when we compare them to what we saw in Egypt last week and a moment ago. Just like the Nile River in Egypt, the presence of the Euphrates and the Tigris were crucial to the evolution of cities in Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, though, what we have is rather than the natural annual flooding that we saw in the Nile River, we have a complex system of engineering. The hydraulic engineers in Mesopotamia knew how to manipulate the rivers in order to irrigate the land and to make it usable for men. So they were great masters of irrigation, and the Mesopotamian architects or engineers created channels, they created canals, and they made possible the cultivation and the continuation of life. And this is something that they recorded. But nature was important for them in some other ways as well. Some of the peoples who lived here, the Sumerians especially, came from around the Caspian Sea, Hazar Denizi as we know it, from beyond the Caspian Sea as a matter of fact. where they retained a memory of distant hilly mountains. So this collective memory led them to create monumental temples, which we call Ziggurat, Z-I-G-G-U-R-A-T. So the ziggurats were literally man-made mountains. So on the one hand, they immediately bring to mind the Egyptian, pyramids, but on the other hand, they are extremely different than the Egyptian pyramids, because the ziggurats were not tombs like the Egyptian pyramids. They also were not built of stone, but they were built of masses of mud brick. So here you see a difference of material, you see a difference of purpose, but both differences are united in their recourse to monumentality. Huge structures. I mean, ziggurats are a bit like stepped, pyramids, but these are natural mountains which were regarded as points of connection between the mortal and the divine, between men and the gods in the heavens. So these were again metaphorical bridges where the Mesopotamians could contact their gods, and with whom they could understand the gods and come into terms with these godly powers. And for that, they built these monumental mountain-like structures, which were called ziggurats. So, not surprisingly, we have various stelae, stone slabs. I apologize for this. This is not Ur-Nammu. It is Naram-Sin. But you don't need to remember these names very well. I mean, the name of the stele is Naram-Sin. But it shows a holy mountain. And the scene here was so important that it warranted a representation. So what you see is a mountain, a literal mountain, and then the king, together with the army of priests, is shown in the act of climbing the mountain. So the act of paying respect to the gods, coming close to the gods, was enacted through a metaphorical mountain, because it was beyond the mountain where the gods were known to reside. And it was through the top of the mountain where the mortals could get closest to the gods. Whether they touched them or not is another issue here. But the quest for height, the quest for monumentality, was with the idea of getting closer to these gods. And the king was at the head of his people, making this possible. So this is the stele of Ur-Nammu. It is in the United States right now, in the Pennsylvania Museum, Archaeological Museum. And it is highly damaged in the form of registers, different scenes, but still we see a very similar scene, or the same topic that we saw a moment ago. The common point between the stele of Ur-Nammu, which is this one, and the stele of Naram-Sin, is that they show the significance of the mountain. We saw a literal mountain in the stele of Naram-Sin a moment ago. But in this stele, the stele of Ur-Nammu, we see the actual building of a ziggurat, a mountain-like temple, which was important for the Mesopotamians, and which was important as a religious typology which dominated the early architectural production of the Mesopotamians. So what you see is a stage-by-stage narration of the building of the Ziggurat. A very important document because it shows us an architectural decision to build the Ziggurat, and then the process of appointing the builders to build the Ziggurat, and then the actual process of building. So here you see the god itself and the king. You see the king with the master masons and the architects who are presenting their plans. The bottom registers don't survive very well. They have been destroyed. But interestingly, the ladder survives. And from the ladder and the fragments of figures, we can tell that the bottom registers, the bottom scenes, actually show us the process of building. So here we have one of the earliest documents that show to us the building while it was being built. So the act of building was so significant that it was deemed important enough to be recorded as a representation that would create a memory for the future. And these Mesopotamians, I'm using this as a very generic term, not referring to particular cultures there, are known for their cuneiform writings. And King Gudea, for example, had architectural plans which are written on the various parts of his skirt as he is seated. So from the Mesopotamians, we have from Hammurabi, you don't need to remember these names, law codes, early laws for humanity. We have architectural plans and records. So there's quite a lot of evidence from what they recorded as well as what they created. So we don't simply have to look at only the archaeological and architectural evidence, but also the deciphering of some of the cuneiform writing. So in this regard, it does not come as a surprise that in Nippur, around 1500 BC, we have a clay tablet which shows us perhaps the earliest plan, the record of a plan that we have of a city. And the inscriptions are done in cuneiform writing to facilitate what is recorded on the remains of this clay tablet. You have a recording, a photogrammetric reproduction of what is here. And we see here what was important to record. Just like the stele of Urnammu and the stele of Naram-Sin, where we saw the significance of the Holy Mountain, the significance of the building of the Ziggurat, here too we see what was important to record as a city plan. And in this double line here, what we see is the waters of the Euphrates, the river. And then along the water, you have the fortification wall. So the water and the fortification are shown together, but also are shown canals for irrigation. So we know that the early Mesopotamian architects and the hydraulic engineers considered it a significant act to be able to direct the waters of nature. Because if you don't redirect the waters, if you don't know how to build canals, if you don't know the techniques of irrigation, then the natural water can flood in ways that are undesirable. So the early architects and engineers knew how to irrigate. So they show the significance of irrigation, but they also show a number of buildings here, and one of them is the ziggurat. So the irrigation and then the ziggurat, which are both very, very important in the creation of a Mesopotamian city, are both shown in this plan of Nippur, which is quite late actually, because some of the cities are far earlier than that, dating to 2600 BC. But nevertheless, it's an early plan. So if we look at Ur, one of the earliest cities, dating to the 2600 or so, from the 3rd millennium BC, we find, as a result of the work of British archaeologists, a whole city surrounded by walls. It has been excavated in sections. These little blobs that you see are the excavated areas. The untidy area here, which is very organic, in no particular geometric ordering, but developed according to a organic the feeling, we'll see shortly. And then in the main area, we have a huge complex, which is the complex of the ziggurat. So we see that the early architectural efforts of the Mesopotamians were concentrated on the monumentality of the ziggurat. This was recorded by the king from the time of decision to build it to the time of actually the process of building it, and then as a final product, it was the focus of the man-built environment within the city. It was centrally located. It was the most monumental edifice, like a mountain. So wherever you were in the city, you saw the ziggurat. So it is quite different than the Egyptian pyramid, but again, it shows the focus of architectural production to be quite significant. Before we go on to the ziggurat, I'm showing you the untidy area from here. Some of the domestic architecture was also revealed, showing a conglomeration of streets, winding streets. I mean, these names were given by archaeologists later, but we don't know that these were the real names. And they lead to houses, each of which had a courtyard. So these houses were turned from outside in. Once you got in from the door giving access to the street, then you came into a central courtyard, and the central courtyard became the organizing element for the different rooms with the functions of sleeping, cooking, kitchen, etc. We also have the evidence of stairs, giving us the sense that there was a second story. So in these domestic units, we have a courtyard principle as the regulator. The courtyard was the organizer for the rooms around the house. And even though each house was slightly different in its dimensions and ordering, this basic typological feature did not change at all. Here you see the plan again, the central courtyard. You have access from the street. You get into the courtyard, and it was around the courtyard that the various rooms of different functions were regulated. And then through the stairs, you had an upper story. The reason that we know it was the houses were open to the sky is because there were posts. I mean, the holes for posts that carried a veranda or a balcony, presumably with the central part open. So this again is significant for us because it shows that in the ordinary dwellers, this was the way the houses were designed. And we shall see a similar attitude also in palaces, except that the rooms were a great many more in number. But the basic architectural principle remained the same, as you see here, a typical house. A paved floor, the wooden posts resting on holes and bases, stairs leading to the upper fourth floor, the posts supporting a balcony or a veranda, and the whole scheme open to the sky, a typical house in Ur. But the concentration of the architects was not the house at all. It was rather what we call the ziggurat here. The ziggurat is a monumental edifice, and all around the ziggurat were the annexes for the priests, for the storage, and so on. So the ziggurat was essentially a stepped structure, and then there were ramps leading to it, leading to the uppermost chamber, and the uppermost chamber was the place where the god came into contact with the people, or where the people came closest to God. The whole system was built upon this idea. So the ziggurat was a representation of a holy mountain that was made by men. But it was not stone, it was mud brick. So you had this massive structure, tons and tons of mud brick piled one on top of each other, creating these terraces. And on top of the terraces, what is still quite remarkable today is that there were drainage channels. There were channels, there were pipes, there was an arrangement of irrigation so that special plants could be created, planted on the platforms like a heaven, and they could be watered quite efficiently. And when you consider the leaks and the seepages that we see all around Ankara in walls that are not well built, I think we respect the ancient Mesopotamian hydraulic engineers who could prevent the masses of mud brick from melting away once you irrigated them, because you irrigated them properly in a scientific manner. So a reconstruction of the ziggurat at Ur shows the processional ceremony, beginning with the ramps. You have a central ramp, and then there are lateral ones, and then through sequences you went higher and higher. Exactly how these ceremonies occurred, what was encountered in the ceremonies is not precisely known, but the edifices are still very much there. In the reconstruction here, you see the evidence of plants and trees. So the irrigation of these through the expertise in designing the distribution and storage of water by the Mesopotamian engineers is very, very evident. I mean, watering such trees requires extensive irrigation, and yet you can easily melt away the walls if you don't do this properly. So they knew where to drain away the excess water, and they knew where to channel the necessary water in order to perpetuate these special gardens. So the scheme is very, very simple. I mean, a stepped, mountain, ramps leading to the mountain, gradually becoming taller, like the peak of a hill, as it approached as much as they could, as high as they could, toward the heavens and toward the gods. And in Ur today, the remains of that mud brick edifice are still very, very impressive. There was some damage in the recent war in Iraq that happened to the pyramid, but apparently it is still, not the pyramid, the ziggurat, but it is still there. So you see this is not piled mud brick. I mean, it is not piled earth, but it is courses of mud brick that was built consecutively by the architects there. So just like the pyramid I showed you, trying to get the right angle, the ziggurat in Ur also had a number of variations. There were urban temples, like the Kafaje temple here. You see an urban temple with a series of walls, and then a small ziggurat-like structure, but not having that mountainous quality as impressive as in Ur. But here, while you have this stepped temple, you also have areas for the storage of crops, for the storage of the archives, but the basic idea is the same. Again, a series of progressions, and then experiments like that gradually led to different kinds of ziggurats. You can identify the different ziggurats, but they all show the basic similar principle. But I show this particular example because you see the drainage. I mean, you are draining the water away from the wall, so they would probably have been plants here as well. Again, another reconstruction showing you the highly articulated exterior surface of the ziggurat. But when we look at the palace in Mari, for example, here, what we see is not a concentration on the ziggurat, but a concentration on the palace. And the organization is around a series of courtyards. And the idea we see coming from the small houses at Ur. The Ur houses had one courtyard and several rooms, but at Mari you had 3 courtyards organizing 260 rooms. And when we look at Khorsabad, several centuries later here, you see that the palace still has the courtyards. There's also a ziggurat, but the similar reversal that took place in Egypt between the pyramid and the Mortuary Temple is taking place here. So the ziggurat became just an annex to the palace. In Khorsabad, the palace is more important. The ziggurat has not yet disappeared. It is still there, but obviously not the focus. It is an annex to the palace. And in this reconstruction of the palace I just saw, You see the monumental palace with its sequences, its courtyards, and then the ziggurat is just a little, annex showing the reversal and the transformation in the relationship between two very significant structures. And even the arrangement of the ziggurat is very dainty, very frilly. I mean, it doesn't have that masculine, massive, stance, but it's more, decorative, showing that its function has changed a little bit. And a very similar, case in point is perhaps to be mentioned if we look at, Babylon in the 7th, century. In the city, you see the ziggurat, which is quite small, but the attention is no longer on the ziggurat beside the river, but it is on the palace, which has a monumental gate, the Ishtar gate here. So the power of religion is now the power of the palace through the years. You see the ziggurat, but the attention is not on that, but on this Ishtar gate. The gate, which is the entrance to the city and to the palace, showing creatures, fantastical creatures, perhaps apotropaic, like the Hittite gates that we saw. But again, it is not celebrating the power of the mountain, but it is celebrating the power of the king who resides in Babylon. And the blue, faience plaques which cover the gate show a great deal of mastery, as you can see here. I mean, the reliefs of the animals are not applied later, but they are part of the brick construction that we see. So we shall repeat this tomorrow, and we'll go on from there. Thank you.